Good evening. I'm Jonathan Albin. This is the Game Master's Guide, and tonight we are going to return to kindness. As a game master and storyteller for 50 years, I have worked with games groups, with individuals, even with schools and training programs to find ways to create an affinity within the players so that they could collectively work together to achieve their goals and defeat the monsters. That's really what it came down to in many cases. But beyond that, there was also this need to be good to each other. And I'm reminded often of the fact that we don't have that in our culture much anymore. And tonight we're going to talk about this idea of kindness, and we're going to do so in the framework of the different parts and elements of a role play game. So, sit back and settle in because this is going to be a kind of a wild ride. We're going to be covering a lot of different topics, all dealing with how do we handle the world that we're in and the individuals that we engage with in a way that we can evidence this kindness. And perhaps I might be putting a different spin on it that you might have heard before. So especially when we get near the end, some of the pieces are pretty amazing. So make sure you stick with us. And if you haven't before, welcome. And if this is your first time getting to know a little bit about me, I have been a storyteller and game master for 50 years. I learned to play at the table of David Arneson, one of the two designers of Dungeons and Dragons, when I was just a kid, and never stopped for 50 years. Therefore, nonstop, I've been running roleplay games, and not limited just to high fantasy either. We're talking about post-apocalyptic, Lovecraftian horror, and all kinds of other things. But today we're going to be looking at this subject of kindness. And if you haven't heard this term before, and if it hasn't been in your vocabulary before, I think you're going to find it's really kind of useful. So right off the bat, what is kindness? The word literally means to be as you would want others to be. The golden rule, if you will, in a nutshell. If you are going to be like you would want others to be towards you, or you are being kind. The feeling of the word, of course, sometimes becomes a little, I guess, culturally flaccid because it's not strong and it's not stern, it's not, definitive. And surprisingly, though, it does take a considerable amount of courage to be kind. There's many years ago, there was a song that was the opposite. It said, you've got to be cruel to be kind. The idea is that you have to be able to be rough and brusque and abrupt with somebody in order to show that you really are like they are, that they are of your type. And that's really what the word kindness carries forward. Now, when we are talking about this in a general term, as we are here usually in the opening salvo, I'm not yet pointing to how that would be impactful to the role-play game environment, except to say that it is far more enjoyable to be at a table with people who are being kind to one another than it is to be at a table where they are being cruel, or even if they are being indifferent, it definitely causes there to be a lack of empathy at the table if there aren't people who are exacting some form of kindness on the table. So having said that, I don't want this to be just a rambling ask or plea for people to be kind to one another. I want to talk about how that kindness can manifest. And so in this first section, I really want to focus on the fact that the elements of kindness do include many of the things that others might see in terms of words that have also pretty much had their meaning crushed over time, such as charity, love, compassion. These are all terms that carry at least some element of kindness, but kindness, of course, is the sort of redheaded stepchild, pardon the vernacular, compared to the others, because kindness is something that fundamentally seems to be a cast off or a throwaway. And so as we go through this element of kindness, I'm asking you to consider from the very opening salvo to look at how rather than why kindness matters. How does it manifest, and how can it change your game? And this video may be as close as we ever get to having a general conversation about being nice to each other, but the elements that make a friendship come from, yes, you have to be brusque, you have to be able to say the hard things, but you also have to have tempered feeling of appreciation and recognition of value of the other person, and these are typified in kindness. Now, before we go into the rest of the elements of kindness, I do have to make a specific series of announcements. This is the closest we're going to get tonight to the actual Nykos News Night. I unfortunately had a tragedy befall last evening, in that my main computer completely broke down, and it's in the shop. It will get repaired, but when that happened, it not only took out my ability to produce videos, but it also took out my personal access to communication. So my Discord channel went down. There's all kinds of things going on. So for the next 2 or 3 days, I ask that you be kind and compassionate with me, because this is where I'm going to need some kindness, because the world didn't go the way I wanted it to. So the Nykos News report for last evening, we're now going to be presenting here. And it's got some high points, so let's get to it, shall we? If I can find the button. All right. So I'm down here in the corner using my other camera. So, hey over there. All right. So the biggest news of the week is that the Luthanin has marched from Nyx, and although he did so as more of a whimper than a rumble, he has raised a considerable force of nearly 2 full legions already, and they have made their way to their established defensive position they are going to attempt to hold in the face of the impending invasion that they're perceiving in the city, in the village of Flo, which is basically center right on the map. The interesting note is that the petitions are still coming in from the various enjoined that are aware of the conflict, and there have been a considerable number of affirmations of support for a unified front against this impending empire. So we will see what happens in future endeavors. I do have to say that we had 2 of our sessions not hold this week, so that the Nykos Nightly News wouldn't have been a full length episode at any rate. But the secondary part of the information that's needed to be mentioned is that far to the east from here, and we'll show how far away this conflict is spreading. Far to the east, in the valley of the Aelchris, which is just south of the Shattered Stones here, the elves of that area, the Eldrin, who are supportive of the last of the elves, are said to be defending that location against what may be a counterinsurgency by actually Inandaran elves, who seem to be, for some reason, much more violent than expected, and have been treating the Eldrin refugees rather badly. So interesting things going on there as well. Further, a validation of the completion of yet another of the ziggurats has occurred, and we're waiting for those crewmen to return to population centers so we can get more details. But it's down to just a few for them to have made the circuit and be confident about which ziggurats remain and what their potential purpose might be. All right, so to finish up this conversation about the Nycos Nightly News, the disadvantage of my system being down for a couple of days does prevent me from being able to give further details about what's going on. There are hints that the individual who visited the southern continent has actually returned and is starting to talk, but we haven't got any verification of that, and we'll have to wait a couple of days for that. So that is all we have at this point for the Nycos news. So, all right, so now I'm going to climb on my soapbox. When we are talking about being kind to one another and being kind in gameplay, we're talking about a lot of elements that have been lost. And when I say lost, they've been either ignored or overrun by more popular processes and have been rather difficult to deal with. Role-playing games going back, long ago, so to speak, were much more regimented than the events of today, in part because of the mechanism of the game originally requiring the players to choose from among them one person to be their caller, and it was almost like a priestly advocacy. They were to hear from the players what they wanted to do to accomplish, collectively and individually, and then provide that information to the game master so he could then adjudicate what the outcomes of those were. And in the case of games that are sandboxes, this is a much more fluid way of dealing with it. But it also is problematic because then one person has sort of the say-so for the whole group. Even if they have collectively agreed to it, it's still necessarily being interpreted by an individual. This wasn't a problem long ago because the idea was, as an adventuring group, you would have a speaker, a leader, who would be responsible for carrying that information, whether by intent or by the very mechanism of gameplay. So it was really an element of being polite for that to occur. And this ties into the element of kindness that I'm trying to drive toward, in that when you are being polite, you aren't talking over one another. You are thinking considerately about what you want to say, but you are waiting to let the other person complete their concept or idea, hearing it all the way through before you make your decision. And in doing so, you are being kindly to them because you would expect them to provide you the same benefit when it's your turn to present your ideas. And so this kindliness, this need to communicate more clearly, gave way to what was being seen in the media and in news reporting and in politics, where people were literally beginning to shout over one another and to refer to each other in negative, deleterious terms, mainly because people were no longer accepting that the other person's ideas might have merit. And this is really where role-playing games have the benefit. If we, as game players, can retransmit to the population at large this idea of being polite, waiting your turn, sharing information equitably, making sure that everybody gets a voice in the setting, then it gets rid of a lot of the difficulties. Now, there is a huge amount of backbiting and naysaying that has evolved in our culture. And as a youngster, I could shine it. I could just kind of put my hand up and say, yeah, well, that's you. We at my game table don't act that way. But I've gotten to the point where I really need to be much more of an advocate for this gentlemanly process, because we need to get past all of the rancor that is built up. I don't know whether this is going to be a video that will be heard by people and they will respond in kind, saying, you know what, we do need to be more kind to one another, or if I'm going to get people who are much more curmudgeonly and wish instead to ignore or destroy the even the concept of kindness. And really what this comes down to for me as a storyteller is I want the players at my table to get their maximum benefit for the amount of time that we have together, whether we have 2 hours or 6 hours. Whatever the time element is, I want to make sure that they get every penny's worth, every cent's worth, every benefit from that game session. And the easiest, most effective way to do that is to make sure that the players are being kind to one another. So in the past, we've had more random ideas about how to do so. For a while, there was the idea of the talking stick, which had come from, I believe, is Native American culture or indigenous peoples culture, of the idea that leadership was represented by the object, and therefore you had the object, you had the floor, and therefore you could carry on the conversation in any direction you wanted, and then you would hand off the stick to the next person. That was okay, and it did assist in helping to maintain the peace. But even the intent of the conversation became problematic when one person was trying to talk about the adventure in particular, and the next person wanted to talk about how another person might play their character, and became less civil because there were ad hominem attacks and there were arguments about someone's rationality or logic or ideology or kindness, and it just got to be a problem generally. And I have to say that I have noticed even in the past few months that there has been somewhat of a break in that, only because the players that I've been with for close to 2.5 years in this campaign. And while the campaign has a 6-year arc and they've got a lot more time to spend together, nonetheless, it's really kind of heartening to see players that are already thinking about how their game sessions can be made better by being nice to one another and being kind and being respectful. Like I said, the word kindness is such a open and general word. It's hard to quantify. But really, when you have a games group that are being generous and kind with one another, you'll see the difference in very short order. And for that, I'm very grateful. So now the question becomes, how can you make kindness? How do you imbue it on people and have them respond in kind? How do you build this cycle of generosity and benevolence toward one another? Well, the first thing you need to do is establish that is what you're attempting to do. Communication is absolutely essential in any process, and addressing the predominance of bad behavior sometimes is a counterproductive thing, even though arguably it might be what's really, quote, necessary. So what I do instead is I speak to the benefit of what I'm doing. So when I'm talking to my group and I say, we're going to be endeavoring to be more kind with one another, or more effective with each other, then I explain how we're going to do that. And like I said, the easiest ways are use a sand glass to determine who has how much speaking time, make sure they stay on topic, try to slow down or reduce the number of member-berry bushes that you find yourself running into, provide the players with the elements that they need to enjoy the game, but also to get them to communicate more fully what it is they wish to have happen in the game, so that the other players can also endeavor to assist them in achieving those goals. The second thing about the actual mechanics of the game is to make sure that you are exemplar for that. In other words, if I am expecting my players to be distinctly beneficial to one another and to be present and aware of other people's desires and concerns, and provide them with the opportunity to speak as often as I do, then that is an issue of my ability to be an example for my players. And that sometimes is rather difficult, especially if you have an old pattern of, perhaps you have a player or two that have a hard time making decisions, and so you kind of want to rush them or push them through, and you really have to sit on your hands and allow them to work through that process themselves, because in doing so you're empowering them to make the decisions and the opportunities that will allow them to be kind one to the other. And I know it sounds, like I said, when I started putting this thought together yesterday, it was kind of a challenge, and it's really, I think, probably because of the season that we're in. I mean, tomorrow is the day of thanks, and tomorrow when I do an episode, it'll be specifically talking about the elements of grace and thankfulness that can happen in game sessions. But in this case, when we're talking about the rudimentary kindness, it's really a matter of opening up this session, open up the game group, and revealing where the difficult spots are so that the players can work on fixing them. And that's really kind of important. I always say, I told you all of that to tell you this. I have noticed in role-playing that I have a better communication potential with my players than I do with my co-workers and the people that I worked with when I was in the workaday world. And the difference really has to do with the mindfulness of my players. They are doing something that they want to do, they like doing, they want it to be good, and so therefore they endeavor to figure out ways to make it better week over week over week. And the irony is that that's really what everyone in any form of employment really wants, is they want improvement and better output day after day after day. But we have gotten into this mode of treating each other poorly, being mean to each other, that we simply have to find ways to overcome if we want the world to be a better place. The obvious way is to share the games that you play with other people, because the more we play games together, the less we have to be angsty about between ourselves, because we're able to define those challenge points in very clear fashion, because we see them in the same way we see the elements of gameplay. Well, as Mr. Gump would say, that's all I got to say about that, and I want to thank you for being here. Discord channel's been filed with, and I'm trying to get everything back in order, and it all has to do with the computer breakdown, so that will be fixed in the near future. If you need to get a hold of me, you can reach out and find my phone number. There's several different places you can find it, and so feel free to contact me that way. Thanks again for being here, and we will see you in the next episode.